Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Elliott and I'm Professor of Food Safety here at Queen's University Belfast. And what I would like to do is to thank all of the participants over the last 4 weeks in our MOOC. The level of interaction has been tremendous. And what we do during these video opportunities is to deal with a small number of the questions that have been raised by people following the course. And I'm joined today by my colleagues who have led the last 4 weeks. But before I do that, one of the questions that we have been asked a number of times is, why did we select the particular topics that we did in relation to the global food crisis? And the answer to that is, we are trying to show the complexity of the subject, the diversity of different scientific disciplines that are trying to contribute to finding some of the solutions to this very complex problem. So today we'll be discussing about animal health and animal welfare, the ways that increased food can be produced through aquaculture, through fisheries, but also some of the impacts of bad nutrition, of malnutrition, particularly relating to metabolic disease disorders. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce my 4 colleagues, and they're going to deal with a number of the questions that have been raised so far. And then as a panel, we'll maybe have a bit of a discussion around those. So first of all, I'm going to start off with Dr. Brian Green. And Brian gave his 1-week course on the MOOC on metabolic diseases. So Brian, maybe you could go through a few of the questions that have been raised to you.
Sure, thank you very much, Chris. So yes, I did pick out a few questions that were of interest that a lot of you commented about. And if you remember back in week 1, 4 weeks ago, we introduced the idea that we're suffering as a global population of all sorts of different types of malnutrition. And in particular, we introduced the concept that malnutrition means bad nutrition. And we discussed at length about overnutrition and how obesity was becoming a bit of a crisis worldwide. And how that was leading to an awful lot of different metabolic disorders. And we talked at length about diabetes and the various health complications that diabetes causes, particularly type 2 diabetes, which is more relevant here in terms of the food crisis. And I was asked a number of questions about the links between diabetes and dementia. So in particular, I have a question from Jackie Mundell Perkins, who asked that they would like to know whether there's a link between type 1 diabetes and dementia, and how strong this link was. And that's quite a complicated question to answer, but I can try and tease that question apart. The answer is that the evidence that we have at the moment, the associations that we know about, are links between elevated blood glucose levels and poor memory function. Okay, so we can isolate a connection between having higher levels of blood glucose and having impaired memory. And that does not translate into a direct link between diabetes and dementia. But the evidence is very strong. It's been done on thousands of people, maybe some of the cohorts as large as 16,000 people. And there is evidence of a link and association between glucose and memory function. And that's very clear. It's not a cause, not a causal factor. It's merely an association. Okay, the proof is not strong enough yet to say their higher blood glucose levels are the real reason behind it. But certainly is a risk factor and an association that's clear. To try and answer your question about type 1 diabetes, it's more difficult. We just know that diabetes per se, it carries an increased risk of dementia. And in particular, the links have been well developed between vascular dementia. We know there's good evidence for vascular dementia. And there's good evidence now, I think, of a link between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease. Now, of course, there are many other types of dementia, and we haven't really worked to an extent. The scientists have not worked to an extent on the links between those. So for type 1 diabetes, the answer is we don't know yet. But carrying a higher level of blood glucose, as some type 1 diabetics will carry a greater risk of impaired memory function, and perhaps, we don't know for sure, a greater risk of dementia. And that's to try and answer that particular question.
Maybe if I just follow up on that a little bit, Brian, because we've had previous discussions about this, you and I, and at one time you thought that eventually dementia will be classified as perhaps type 3 diabetes. Is that likely to happen? And do you think if it does, there will be less stigma associated with having Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease as opposed to something that people now just think is part of life?
Okay, so yeah, this notion of type 3 diabetes, and it's not a very well established thing in the field. Type 1 and type 2 are the recognized conditions. Some have put out the notion that there's a type 3 diabetes out there, and that's based on the notion that in type 2 diabetes, we have impaired insulin activity. We have something called insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. They think that in some people with diabetes, they also have impaired insulin activity in the brain, or insulin resistance of the brain, and that starves the brain of glucose. And we know very well that in dementia, there's impaired glucose metabolism in the brain. And that's why people have brought forward this notion of having a type 3 diabetes, and maybe there's something going wrong in terms of glucose metabolism in the brain. And I would not jump into calling it type 3 diabetes just yet until we know an awful lot more about it. In terms of research, we know that there are good molecular bases for linking diabetes and dementia. So, for example, there's a protein called amyloid, which is modified in the pancreas in diabetes and modified in the brain in Alzheimer's disease. We also know about the connections between insulin resistance in diabetes and insulin resistance potentially in Alzheimer's disease. So those are reasons to connect them on a kind of molecular basis, but I would not jump into calling it a disease just yet, type 3 diabetes. But yeah, you're quite right. The associations are there, and maybe there's a basis for that in the future. As we get down into working out what all of these conditions are, I think at the moment, you said to me actually not long ago, years ago, we treated breast cancer as breast cancer. And now we know that there's anything up to potentially 15 different conditions that cause breast cancer, and they all potentially could be treated by different drugs. So we now start to think about the metabolic disease that we know about being perhaps many more than we know about, and we just haven't defined them yet. And the same thing about dementias. There's perhaps even more subforms of dementia that we haven't quite worked out yet.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That's incredibly interesting. Have you some other questions that you want to talk about?
Well, we also had a bit of interest about the, in a wider context, looking at socioeconomic status and the prevalence of obesity and diabetes. And a number of people did not want to acknowledge this was maybe the case. They were saying, well, diabetes I said type 2 diabetes is a disease, and it does discriminate because it's elevated in certain socioeconomic classes. So a lot of people were saying, no, it doesn't discriminate. It affects everybody, no matter what their background. And that's absolutely true. It doesn't matter where you come from in life, what socioeconomic status you have, but you could develop diabetes potentially, no matter where you come from. But the risk factors are greater for those of lower socioeconomic status, and that's because we know, and it's very well established, that people of lower socioeconomic class have higher levels of obesity and also higher levels of type 2 diabetes as a population. That's the case. Some were asking about what the causes of the drivers of that were, and it's a very, very complex thing to try and answer. And it can be everything from convenience to having work longer hours. It could be anything from what their diet is like, what their exercise patterns are, and so on, their lifestyle. So that's a very difficult one, and probably would pass over to to sociologists to try and answer a question like that one. But certainly, I would maintain that the link between socioeconomic status and the development of these diseases is in as good a strong association, and it's well recognised by the National Obesity Observatory, also by NICE, National Institute for Clinical Health and Excellence, clinical health, well recognised links. So that was the other question I wanted to kind of make it clear that it is a disease and it does discriminate, but that's simply because of the patterns that we see in our population and the links that we know about.
So you're a believer in nature and nurture. So nature, you have a genetic predisposition to a particular disease, but based on your lifestyle, you have the potential to have more triggers for the disease. I mean, it's talked about in so many different forms of disease now, in cancers, for instance. And even today on the BBC, it was talking about the epidemic of childhood obesity in the UK. So now 1 in 3 children are classified as obese. That's 3 times the number of children in Holland, which is only a few hundred kilometers away. And the explanation from that, do you think, is down to lifestyle? It's down to exercise? I mean, have you any thoughts why we had such huge differences over a very, very small geographic area?
It's a hard question to answer.
That's why I
asked. It's complex, it's multifactorial. I would say, actually, this news story this morning was about how it was leveling off, and we might actually be gaining some traction, particularly in the under 10 children categories. That the obesity rates weren't shooting up quite so high as they have been in the last number of years. So it's still very prevalent, and it's certainly not being solved, but it's not going up the same rate that it used to. The drivers of that is perhaps, I would say parental influence, because parents decide what children eat, and parents decide the activity levels of their children to some extent. So I think it perhaps has come down to societal awareness and a wish to try and improve the lives of their children. Perhaps might be a reason for the leveling off we've seen. But I think one of the biggest things, and it hasn't been talked about extensively in the MOOC at all, and we kind of pushed it to one side in our discussions, was the whole notion of activity. Activity levels and exercise levels in our population have been going down for decades and decades, predominantly because our professional lives are driven by increasingly sedentary lifestyle, increasingly sedentary work lives, rather than physical jobs, and a lot of our tasks replaced by automated procedures, by equipment, by machinery, less labor-intensive jobs. So that's probably the main reason, one of the big drivers of obesity that hasn't been talked about that much in the MOOC is physical activity. And I think that's probably one of the big things in terms of children who play computer games and use mobile phones and do not run around the park and so on as much as they used to. But the difference between, say, the UK and Holland, I don't know why, and perhaps physical activity could be one of the reasons for it. Yeah.
So maybe just to finish off with Brian, is just to follow up on that. A statistic again that I read fairly recently said that the calorific intake, both in children and adults, has not changed significantly in the last 30 years. So that tends to support the hypothesis about exercise. Yet the food industry believes it is being demonized now as being the cause of diabetes. And a lot of people are blaming the food industry about having very high sugar levels in their food. Do you think there's any role in relation to responsibility for the major food producers globally to think about how they can help address the problem?
Well, I think the food industry has a very big role to play It contributes to this. I mean, they have a big influence. They're a stakeholder in what we all eat. They're driven by making profits. That's what they do. They're businesses. They have to do that. You mentioned the fact that perhaps our calorie intake hasn't changed that much in the last 30 years, but calories are not everything. You know, as you well know, there are many other constituents of food that have a big influence on our health. So we're talking about the levels of vitamins, minerals. We're talking about people consuming vegetables and fruit as opposed to just carbohydrates. So the analysis of those things is probably more important. So there is an increased awareness of the public, and they are, at the end of the day, the market for the food companies, and hopefully food companies will respond to what people want, but people don't always want what's good for them. So I think the idea will be that we should be looking for highly nutritious food that's not calorie intensive, that's balanced. But food companies are not, do not decide what we eat. So we have, as individuals, the right to decide what we eat, and food companies only respond to what we do. But having said that, they have a responsibility. I know that the soft drinks market industry has been targeted quite a bit over sugar levels the last number of years, and they have responded to some extent on that. But sugar, yes, is a problem. So I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that. They have a role to play.
So thanks very much, Brian. This is a good opportunity to introduce Professor Paulo Prodal. So when we talk about nutritious food, fish is very much on the mind of many people. It is described as a way of feeding the extra 2 billion people that will appear on our planet over the next 20 to 30 years. So, Paulo, in relation to the questions that the followers have asked you, what would you like to follow up on?
Thank you, Chris. I mean, over the past week or during the week, we discussed about issues related to fisheries in aquaculture. I was actually amazed by the number of very interesting questions that were posed by the many attendees to the course in there. Again, we did discuss the issues facing fisheries as a limited resource, and very different to what happens in land-based farming. We're dealing with the management of what is a wild populations, and in a somewhat very different type of environment, which presents a number of difficulties in terms of management. We've discussed the fact that many fisheries on a worldwide basis are now in decline. Others are now deemed to be beyond point of sustainable exploitation, and that obviously have triggered concerns in terms of long-term sustainability. Now, in parallel to the exploitation and management of wild resources or fishing resources, we also have been observing an ongoing growth of the aquaculture industry, which is seen by many as the natural response to the ongoing need to provide fisheries-derived protein to meet the ongoing demand on a growing world population, not only from developed nations, but again, we have to consider the number of other emerging nations that now have access to potentially better nutrition derived from fisheries there. There has been a lot of concerns in relation to the growth of the aquaculture industry, and in particular the potential negative interactions with wild populations. And one topic that was over and over into the discussions over the week is the problem of escapes or fish escapes from fish farming into wild environment, and the potential interactions that farmed fish can have with wild fish. And the reason for the concern is that farmed fish, by a number of reasons. They are somewhat genetically distinct from their wild counterparts because they have been ongoing the process of domestication. So they no longer have the same type of genes that you would expect in the wild. Problem is when they escape, they can potentially interbreed with wild fish, which themselves are, if you like, the results of the evolutionary process. They are well adapted to their particular rivers, and any integration, if you like, can potentially have a negative effect, whereby the offspring of fish or hybrid fish between wild and farm fish might not be as suited to survive in the kind of wild environment there. Now, we've been pointing out the problem, been discussing the problems, and a lot of questions came about why not just improve the farming conditions, so try to prevent escapes. And this is a very good question, and it's one that has been brought over and over, and it's being discussed by many people. It is not so straightforward. I mean, the nature of these cages and the fact that they have to be in the open wild environment, if you like, make them particularly susceptible to, say, adverse weather conditions. And so there has been a lot of research try to improve the quality of these cages, but still we are somewhat a long way to go. There are other issues as well. I mean, the costing involved with improving technology and cost benefit in terms of production and the best ways around in terms of maintaining high production and cost low in terms of aquaculture. So it's something, it's basically ongoing. There has been a lot of research on the area, but it's
I think that's a very good overview of some of the complications about wild caught fish and aquaculture. And again, from everything that I read, it seems to be that the wild fisheries are struggling in relation to sustainability now. They struggle to make a profit, and that aquaculture is a booming industry.
Definitely. This is another good question or that was brought about by people that attended the course. Is aquaculture the solution? And I would say it's part of the solution. Basically, it will be very difficult to meet demand, the increasing demand for fish-derived protein based upon exploitation of wild resources alone. The problem there that we are dealing with a finite source, if you like, of populations that they need to be managed to a point of what we call maximum sustainability. Beyond that point, the populations become endangered. I mean, you cannot really capture more than the populations can support. Now, aquaculture has been perceived as the way out of it, but we are still pretty much on its infancy in relation to, again, land-based farming activities there. We're still lagging behind. I have a question which is brought very interesting here. Mary Papa Nicolau, she was concerned about the fact that she was eating genetically modified fish when she would much rather have their wild counterpart. Two issues on this particular question. The first one, when you're talking about aquaculture or selective breeding in aquaculture, or as we discussed over the week, the use of genetics to assist into selective breeding program, we're not necessarily here referring to genetic manipulation or transferring genes from one fish to another, say not necessarily genetic modify organisms in here. Now, this type of research is indeed ongoing, but insofar as aquaculture is concerned, we're actually trying to capitalize onto wild resources. Basically, here we are using genetics to try to accelerate the process of domestication, which is not very different to what has happened into farmland or land-based farming. In other words, we've been carrying out this process of selective breeding into cattle, pig, poultry for hundreds of years. And the process basically means by crossing individuals which have the desirable traits, say fast-growing, best food conversion, for instance. And over generations, we can actually select to those particular traits. The problem with that is that it takes time and it's very expensive. Now, we can use genetics to greatly accelerate this process by basically mapping the genome of individuals which have the desirable traits, and then using genetic markers to select individuals well in advance of the crossing procedures per se. So we can bypass a lot of the time required to develop a domesticated aquaculture race, if you like. Now, the fish produced during this process, or the domesticated fish produced during that process, is not very different from the cattle or the pig that we have on a table on a daily basis. I mean, say it's a very good product, and definitely not genetically modified strict sensus. It's basically is a domesticated breed, if you like, that we actually bred for aquaculture.
Okay, and I'll ask one final question, and I will make it as difficult as possible, as you can imagine. And it's to talk about sustainability and food security in the context of farming and agriculture. So across the world, there is a demand for more and more food, yet the more that I read, the more farmers are struggling to make a living. And do you think there's a possibility that aquaculture could be one of the potential solutions to that, where farms who traditionally raise animals, land-based animals, should also think about developing a number of fish ponds within their farms? I've seen some cropping up in England recently. Do you think that is a trend that could help farming?
I'll say absolutely. There is a lot of incentive for aquaculture. I mean, one of the major criticisms for the aquaculture on a worldwide basis has been the environmental impacts of aquaculture. Now, most of these impacts are invariably linked to the most widely known aquaculture activities, which are marine-based. Say you're talking about Atlantic salmon, sea bream, even Atlantic cod. But there is a lot of prospects for inland aquaculture, and this is an area which has not been fully exploited as yet, in particular into the Western nations. I mean, it's very common in Asia. We say definitely aquaculture, freshwater aquaculture of carp and it's been ongoing for actually thousands of years, and it's very well developed now. Definitely in emerging nations or in other nations where protein is an issue. So you're talking, for instance, in places in Africa now. There is a lot of talk and discussions about developing incentives or providing incentives for developing of local aquaculture based upon local species. Again, it's surprising that we talk about aquaculture on a worldwide basis, but there are very few actual species which are actually used for aquaculture. So there's potential for looking into local species and potentially develop this on a more local base to supply protein and food for local communities. So definitely is the way to go.
Okay. Paulo, thank you very much. It was very clear aquaculture could play a massive role in food security, but huge number of challenges ahead. I'm going to switch now I'm going to introduce Professor Aaron Mall, and in Aaron's week and his colleagues dealt with the issues of animal health, particularly surrounding parasites that can affect many different types of farm animal species. So Aaron, over to you now. Maybe you could deal with some of the questions that have come your way.
Certainly can. Thank you very much, Chris. I think, first of all, we'd like to thank all of those who got involved in the debates with us, and very lively debates sometimes, which is a good thing, sort of challenging the edge of our understanding and of your understanding of this topic. And I think also amongst this week, we also challenged the way we package subject areas into little boxes so that we can understand them better. We could clearly see through much of the debate how it reached out to things that Brian was working on, things that Paolo works on, things that Chris works on, and we could see that there's actually a continuum of activity going on in the research that we do. But looking at the questions, well, what we tried to do was synthesize those questions into those that come up most often, and one of them was around chemotherapy. And of course, chemotherapy it's the foundation of the way we control parasites, period. We don't have good vaccines. Most of the management control methods have mixed results in terms of their efficacy, or they can contribute, but they can't control it on the level that drugs do. So we're stuck with chemotherapeutics. And we talked a lot about our methods to try and identify new drug targets, and to try and bring these through to development so that we have a new battery of drugs which help us get around the main problem facing parasite control and food security now in this area, which is resistance. Resistance is happening. It's happening very quickly. I mean, the last chemical class has just shown after 3 years resistance in sheep and goats in New Zealand. So that's very fast turnaround for these worms to become resistant to a new chemical class of drug. And that's the challenge that we face. We need to keep coming up with new drugs. And we actually had a number of people who raised this point, and it was a very good point. If the drugs are failing, why are we spending time trying to find new ones? And I understand why that was said, but think of it in this. Our antibiotics are failing. Do we stop looking for new ones? No, we need them. Without new drugs, we fail to control the parasites. So we need these new drugs. We need pipelines of new drugs until we develop other more sustainable methods of control. And of course, one of those is vaccines, which I'll maybe come back to later in this discussion. But that's where we're at in terms of looking for new chemotherapeutics. Looking forward, part of our course looked at RNAi, and we talked about this method of switching off genes in the pathogen, in the parasite, as helping us validate whether or not that was a good drug target or a good vaccine target. And most people contributed to that well and understood that. But a few raised the point, could this also be used as a direct treatment for the worms? In other words, not just as a method to identify new targets for new chemical controls, but really as a method to basically be used directly as drugs. Could we treat animals or even have plants that use RNAi to kill the parasites infecting them? And I think that is a very interesting area that is most advanced in plants, where they have now developed plants that make these RNAi triggers that specifically stop the parasites in their track. And we'd like to see that technology developed in animals. But of course, the RNAi revolution, which is happening now with clinical trials for a number of human conditions underway, is very much in the early phase. But I suspect in most of our lifetimes, and certainly in many of your lifetimes, you will see a lot of new RNAi therapies for many human disease conditions, including, we hope, the treatment of parasites.
Okay. Maybe I'll just come in and ask you something, because you talked about chemotherapeutic agents and you talked about vaccines. From my understanding of parasites, they are remarkably clever creatures at avoiding vaccines, because they can live in our system without our own immune system detecting us. And they are also extremely good at bypassing chemical agents. So what do you think the real future holds? Because of the increase of resistance now, you can see the data from all over the world is getting a bigger and bigger problem. And there's a finite resource there. Should the effort go on to developing new drugs, or should the emphasis be on vaccines, or should it be try to control the vectors of the parasites themselves?
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on in trying to address that question. I think it comes down to, do we put our eggs in one basket? And I think if the pragmatic answer is, I don't think we can risk that. Right now, the only things that have worked effectively, and we're talking about 99% kill rates, are chemotherapeutics. So we know that they can work. We know that once they go out there, if we over rely on one class, they will become resistant. So I think it's incumbent upon us to change the strategy of having single type, chemical class type anti-worm drugs or anti-parasite drugs to having multiple chemical class drugs. And there are a few already out there, and they're doing very well. And I think what will happen is, as new anthelmintic classes or new anti-parasite classes come along, they will become combination therapies. That's without doubt. And that will not stop resistance, because I think it's fair to say it isn't if resistance will happen. It will happen if we keep using the same drugs, because these things evolve to be resistant. We select the resistant populations. What we also need to do then is put support into the development of vaccines. Vaccines appear a much more sustainable strategy in the long term, in that they're prophylactic, so they're preventative. They prevent the disease in the first place, which is good. Treatment is usually a single dose, which has a long period of control. Then drugs we have to treat potentially every 6 months. And also then they don't get the chemicals in food, which was one of the things that is going to come up in a few minutes when we get onto that topic. So vaccines would be good. Right now, exactly for the reasons that Chris has highlighted, we haven't got good vaccines, because these are smart animals in terms of their chemical complexity. Their genomes are large, and many of them, they have lots of immune evasion strategies. But there have been experiments in model organisms and model animals where vaccines have worked well. What we have failed to do so far is translate these to the livestock. But this will happen. I think it is just a matter of time for this to happen. But I think it is difficult. And therefore, the impediment to progressing that has been the resources put into that type of work. And I think whenever the problem gets to a point where it's probably too late in terms of food production, then much more resource will be put in, and we will get our vaccines. That's what I believe.
So it's interesting you talk about the economic stimulus towards vaccines. Now, if we take the example with the pharmaceutical industries around the world, is there a real interest in developing new anthelmintic drugs? When we compare, there's not a huge amount of interest in developing new antibiotics for the human race. What's the kind of
yeah, a very, very good question, Chris. One of the enigmas with using drugs for parasite control is the opposite of what Brian was talking about earlier, where they're talking about very tailored medicines. For worms, for parasites, we don't want tailored medicines. I mean, if we just take horses, over 60 different species of strong nematode, these are roundworms. Do we want a drug for every one? We couldn't possibly generate a drug for everyone. So what we want are broad spectrum drugs that kill many different parasites, if at all possible. So we've got these, what are generally blockbuster drugs that come out and wipe out potentially GI nematodes en masse, and that's great. What happens then is everyone uses that drug, and it's really good. So therefore, the drive for a pharmaceutical to make a new drug is dependent on them predicting resistance. I think we're at a point now where they realize resistance will happen. So they're starting to rebuild pipelines of drug development on the back of the failure of ivermectins. Ivermectins came out, as we know, in the early 80s or mid 80s, and blew away all of the other drugs in terms of potency, efficacy, spectrum. And basically what happened then is the focus on animal health work for antiparasitics dropped to really low levels. A lot of pharmaceuticals closed their activities in that area, and now we're reaping the consequences of that. We've got resistance undermining our ability to control them. So my answer, although I made it very long there, which I apologize for, is that we need to do both.
Okay. And there was a great breakthrough was announced just a few weeks ago to say that a new way of culturing bacteria from the soil was developed in the US. And what we're told is 99% of bacteria in the soil cannot be cultured, yet the 1% produces most of the antibiotics that we know of at the moment. So do you think there's potential for that dynamic change in how soil bacteria can be grown, that you might be getting some new candidate molecules coming through from that route?
I think undoubtedly, I mean, natural product drug discovery is definitely growing in the area of parasite control from plants, from marine resources. People are looking and doing the screens. Of course, one remarkable difference that we are aware of is that when you get these natural compounds, they tend to be structurally very complex compared to the usually relatively easy to synthesize drugs that the pharmaceuticals like to produce, which has been the standard up until now. So with these natural products, they're a bit more challenging in terms of the chemistry involved to make them. So of course that takes more time to develop and takes more cost to produce that in very large numbers. If it's a bacterial product, obviously that would be, and they could grow it, that would be very, very good. There is a crystal type protein which a bacterium produces, which is the Gates Foundation is funding now as a treatment for some nematodes, because it's natural, it's produced by some bacteria and it's naturally toxic to nematodes. So they're looking at this type of approach already.
Okay. And like your predecessors, I will finish with one very difficult question for you, and this will go on public record, of course. You talked about one of the big problems is resistance. Are farmers to blame for that? Pause.
I'm pausing because I think the blame has to be shouldered across everyone. I think the pharma have been remiss in producing new chemicals for the farmers. I think the farmers have then, based on improved production levels, moved to the situation where normally they treat all regardless of infection. That has enhanced the rate at which resistance occurs. So they're in a situation now where farmers know that their production is improved by mass treatment, yet all the scientists and pharma now and veterinarians, etc., are telling them don't mass treat. But they're interested in the production on their farm, and that controls their income. And yet we're telling them, oh, take a little bit of a hit by not treating all your animals, just treat those that are scarring or showing signs of infection. So I think that is a dynamic that is very difficult, and I think it's understandable why the farmers have not followed the guidelines. Not all farmers, I think many farmers. So there is an issue of communication, maybe education, and that interaction, I think, between science and farming, which is not as good as it should be.
Okay, Aaron, thanks very
much.
Thanks, Chris. So to start off with, when we were talking, we talked about diabetes and obesity, and it's a very emotive issue in relation to human health. But now we're going to talk about animal health and animal welfare, and I don't think there's any issue more emotive than animal welfare is. You get so many different and diverse opinions on the subject. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Niamh O'Connell, who gave us our week on the MOOC on animal welfare. And maybe Niamh, you'd like to cover some of the questions that have come your way.
Sure, I would. And yes, it certainly was an emotive issue. And I think for anybody who read the comments that came up on the course, it was fascinating. The discussion was really enlightening. There was a lot of debate, but it was all very constructive. And yeah, I for one found it fascinating. And I think a lot of people felt the same way. And I think it was relieving for me to a certain extent, because I really grappled with setting this element of the MOOC, because it's quite easy to talk about why we have intensive farming systems. It's quite easy to talk about the evolution and the reasons that they have come into being and they've come into play. So we know about population growth, you know, we know about urbanization, we know about economic growth, we know about all these factors which lead to the development of intensive livestock systems. And again, you know, it's relatively easy for me to list off some of the key animal welfare problems that have arisen as a result of intensive livestock farming. And we can talk about some of the drivers that are in place at the moment that are likely to lead to increased intensity in the future. But then you get to the issue of saying, well, you know, what do we do? How do we address these problems? And I could see in the comments coming through that people felt similarly, and that everybody said, this is difficult. How do we address this issue? What can we do? And it led to some really interesting discussion, which, as I said, I found fascinating to read and to partake in on occasion. So some people had suggested that, you know, why don't you talk about some of the developments in genetics? You know, why don't you talk about some of these veterinary developments that have happened that can alleviate some of these problems in relation to farm animal welfare? And I agree. There are many developments that have happened in genetics and genomics and in veterinary care and stockmanship and nutrition that can address specific issues and problems. The issue is that there are many problems to address. And secondly, the issue is that many of these adaptations will invariably result in a loss in productivity or increased costs or reduced returns. So rather than dealing with the minutiae of all of the specific welfare issues and how we can address them specifically, I wanted to take a more macro approach and ask, well, how can we ensure that the biggest changes, the most important changes to livestock systems actually happen? And that's why I took a step back and I didn't talk about things like genetic strategies or foot bathing strategies or, you know, the on-the-ground factors that can make a difference. And many people, you know, made the comment that a lot of it is common sense in relation to dealing with animal welfare issues, and it is. You know, we know the solutions to many issues, but the problem is actually getting them in place on the ground. So I took the feeling that we can't address everything. We need to perhaps prioritize, and I suggested 3 possible solutions to try to address the main farm animal welfare issues. And the first was that I think we need to develop science. And naturally, I would say that as a farm animal welfare scientist, but I think it's essential. I think the crux of our concern about farm animal welfare lies in the fact that we feel that animals have the capacity to suffer. That's the crux of our issue when we're concerned about animals. We feel that they feel pain and suffering. We have yet to develop reliable methods of measuring pain and suffering in farm animals. And it reflects the fact that farm animal welfare science is quite a new science. You know, it has only been around for a matter of decades. We're still working towards those good measures of farm animal welfare. And I think that is essential. We need to know what the subjective experience of animals is as much as we possibly can to give them a voice in these ethical debates and allow us to prioritize the issues that we need to address, because we can't address anything. So I think developments in science are important. And the other solution, I think, is that we need developments in farm animal welfare legislation. And a lot of people talked about this in the discussions. It's acknowledged that for many people, the minimum standards set in farm animal welfare legislation, there's a void between them and what most people would like to see at ground level. So we need to try to bridge that gap between public perception of what should be in place and what is actually in place in terms of farm animal welfare legislation. And that is more difficult than it sounds. I think this legislation, as well as I mentioned in the video, has got to be implementable. You have to be able to implement it at a farm level, and it has to be implemented. And again, that's no mean feat when you're talking about farm animal welfare legislation. So I think science is important. I think legislation and policy and quality assurance schemes are important in moving forward this topic. But as I said in the MOOCs, I think probably the biggest solution is down to consumer demand. We are at the top of this chain of stakeholders as the end consumers. can't help but think that we must be able to have more power in terms of affecting things at a farm level. And this led to a lot of really interesting debate about, why this isn't happening, why consumers aren't doing more, taking more of an active involvement. And we know from research that whenever you survey people, they say they are concerned about farm animal welfare. And in fact, many will say that they're willing to pay more for high welfare food. But this doesn't always translate into behavior at the checkout. And this is the problem as we see it. Some people in the discussion talked about perhaps we should stop eating meat or eat less animal products. But I don't think that necessarily is well, it's not a short-term solution, I don't think. And I think perhaps many people were saying that perhaps we will have to cut down on livestock consumption anyway for environmental purposes. And that may be the case in the future, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not going to farm the animals that we do farm still intensively. So I think we need to come back to the fact that we need shorter term solutions, and the fact that people do appear willing to pay more for high welfare food, but it just we haven't as yet been able to harness that willingness. And we don't, we can make quite big differences at a farm level with quite small increments in price and product price. So then I set one of the tasks in the MOOC was to talk about, well, what are the barriers to buying high welfare food? Why are consumers not buying high welfare food? And this just led to fascinating discussion as we went on. For many people, I think they felt labeling was an issue, that they couldn't get clear information on the welfare provenance of food from labeling. And they felt that led to confusion when trying to, and really just talking about supermarket or retail purchasing at this stage. So labeling was an issue, and confusion over animal welfare issues was also an issue. And many people talked about how the fact that people don't know anymore what the problems are. There's a disconnect between consumers and farming. Somebody mentioned in the comments about all we see now is a plastic wrapped piece of meat. There's no connection anymore between where that has actually come from and how it's being produced. And there was examples given of children in certain schools not knowing where milk came from, where the method of farming to produce it. So there was a lot of talk about this disconnect between consumers and agriculture, and how that could be a key factor in causing confusion in animal welfare issues and not knowing what issues to think about or to base their purchasing on. So labeling, confusion are issues, and I think that they can be addressed through education, government schemes, things like that. But the biggest issue, probably no surprise, that most people talked about was price, and that the price differential was just too big to be able to afford to purchase high welfare food. And I'd asked people to send in examples of standard and free range chicken and to talk about price differentials. And some of the examples were really interesting. I mean, at least double the price for standard versus free range chicken in some parts of the world. So price is a big factor. And people are willing to pay a little more for high welfare food, but they're not willing to pay that much. So I think a key issue coming out of this MOOC and the discussion is that we really need to find a way to perhaps bridge the gap between what people are willing to pay and the true cost of production of higher welfare food. And to do that, we need to think about, well, actually getting a better handle on what are the true costs of high welfare food. And that came up in the discussion as well, the true costs of production. And we maybe need to think about perhaps government schemes that could perhaps subsidize purchasing of high welfare food as well from different angles. So I think we moved the conversation along quite a lot with the discussions, and it was very interesting. I have some specific questions which I'm happy to talk about as well that were posed.
I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. There were quite a few questions that came through as time went on. Get my right page here. Roger B had asked, he'd like to know my thoughts on why consumers seem to be largely convinced that buying free-range eggs is value for money rather than free-range meat products. And he wanted to know why I thought that was the case, why you have this consistent buying on welfare grounds really for eggs, but not for other products. And I think there are a couple of issues probably likely to affect this. And just as I've mentioned just before, I think price is probably one of them. You know, the price differential between standard and free-range eggs, I don't think is as great as between standard and free-range meat. So it may be that price is one of the key factors there. I think the issue, the welfare issue as well, is probably something at play here. I mean, it has been mentioned before by welfare scientists that people may find certain animal welfare issues easier to grasp than others. And I don't think I'm doing a disservice to consumers by saying that, but issues like cages are quite easy to grasp. So there's a battery cage, there's none. There's a sort of a binary solution. It's there or it's not. People can be anthropomorphic about it. They can put themselves in the situation of the animal and think, I don't think I would like that. So I think the issue is probably important here. Hens, eggs have been produced within cage systems and they're now free range, and that's quite a simple solution to an issue to think about or to grasp. Whereas broiler chicken meat doesn't normally involve any cages of any description, so whether they're free range or not. So the issues, the welfare issues at play are different between intensive and more free range systems. And I think people may not be so familiar with what the welfare issues might be. So I think the type of issue, the fact that it's a cage or not, is probably one factor at play here. And also the price differential is probably another factor. Kate Grant had asked, she said there was no mention this week of other animals reared for meat, for example, sheep. Can we therefore assume that sheep farming for lamb production does not employ questionable animal welfare practices? And I think, I guess I just wanted to make the point that really in the topics that I covered, I tried to select just some sort of textbook examples of welfare problems that are present in the literature. And you can see there's quite an extensive publication list at the end of my section, and you can read the publications yourself to get a bigger background to that. So it wasn't that some areas are more important than the other. I just picked specific examples to talk about. But I hope the point came across throughout that I don't believe that the fault lies at the hands of primary producers here. I think it's part of a system that we're all stakeholders in, if you like, and I hope I made that point. So have I time for one more question?
Well, maybe just to follow up on a couple of things that you said.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about food production, welfare of those people who produce the food is incredibly important, and from that has come the fair trade movement. And you will have the fair trade logo on a growing number of food products now. Do you think there would be any excuse upon appetite for the development of a generic fair trade in relation to animal welfare? So it's not just one company trying to market their product to try to get market differentiation, that if it becomes a standard, there's more likely to be uptake and more likely that people will buy it?
I do. I absolutely do. And I think it actually comes back to this course and the question of sustainability. People tend not to be just interested in one element of sustainability, whether it's food safety, whether it's animal health or welfare, environmental factors. They tend to want to buy a package. And I think for it to be easy for them not to have to make different ethical decisions every time they buy a different product. So I think, yes, there would be an appetite for some more comprehensive scheme whereby animal welfare is included along with many other positive traits for that product.
One of the things that you brought up was the economics. And in Europe, we've probably got the strictest animal welfare regulations in the world. And what a lot of European farmers would say is, we cannot compete because we have to meet these standards. And do you think this might be a kind of an antidote to that line that people take about the costs involved?
And I do think it's a very valid point. We have imports, and there's a free market there where people can buy what they like, and that's why I think legislation is important. But it will always be an unlevel playing field, if you like, between different parts of the world. But the emphasis has to come back to the consumer, and they're seeking the provenance of the food that they're eating on welfare and other grounds, if you like. So I think that's why I think the consumer is key in all of this.
Okay, so I think our time's running out, so I will, of course, finish with a difficult question for you. You read on a label to say that something was produced to very high welfare standards. Mm-hmm. How do you know it's true?
You don't, because as I say, welfare is a young science, and its definition differs depending on who you talk to. For some people, welfare means low levels of stress, good health. That's their definition of welfare. For somebody else, it means not suffering. It doesn't really matter whether the animal is healthy or not, as long as it's not suffering. So as yet, and where we stand in terms of animal welfare science, it's very subjective, and it's down to individual value judgments whether that will meet your criteria for high welfare or not. Because, as I say, it differs between people.
Okay, thanks very much. So it's unfortunately we have to wind up our conversation now. You can probably judge by the conversation we've had. We could talk all day about some of these issues. And what we try to do within our MOOC, both the first 5 weeks and the second 4 weeks, was try to cover a number of the different difficult factors in relation to the food crisis, into food security, to give you a flavour of some of the science that underpins some of those big topics, but some of the issues that still need to be resolved. And over the past few months, I've met so many people who have been taking the MOOC and found it absolutely fascinating. So we hope that you fall into that category as well. So really, just to finish off with, we very much appreciate you taking the course. We hope you enjoyed it. And the recommendation, if you like our course, look at Future Learn to see what other courses are there in the space of food, or indeed anything else. And with that, I think we will all thank you very much for your contributions.